Phenomenology and Meditative Consciousness. In this video, I'd like to weave together four principal strands: phenomenology, falsifiability, meditative consciousness from a Buddhist perspective, and social change. Whereas some of my last videos have been a bit more about exploring the emotional, personal side of philosophy and psychology, this one will probably be a bit more technically oriented. First, let's examine the question of the falsifiability of phenomenological insights. Briefly, phenomenology has to do with the philosophical or psychological activity of systematically reflecting upon our subjective experience in order to reveal and articulate its underlying structure or significance. Falsifiability, in turn, has to do with how assertions can't really be regarded as true or trustworthy if there's no chance to demonstrate that they could possibly be false. In the realm of the natural sciences, falsifiability isn't too difficult, at least at the conceptual level. It's simply a matter of making objective empirical observations or defensible logical inferences that contradict the hypothesis at hand, or that produce a contradiction within a body of theory. Phenomenological insights, however, proceed according to a different, more subjective logic. Within the purview of phenomenological inquiry, insights initially gain a confirmation or disconfirmation, depending upon the extent to which they accord with the reader's own reservoir of experience. If these insights accord well with many people's experience, then their truth value can eventually spread across the larger social, intersubjective landscape. If they fail to do so, then their truth value is effectively falsified and falls away. However, this picture is made more complex by the fact that our personal and intersubjective experiential reference points are always changing as we grow as individuals and as the larger cultural context changes. Basically, the metrics and means of the falsifiability of phenomenological insights are always in flux because our personal and collective pool of experience is always changing over time. Of course, the same could be said of the truths of the natural sciences. Since objective observation is itself a type of experience, changes in our experiential field can also easily influence the process of confirming or disconfirming objective conclusions in the first place. In addition, the basis for falsifying objective truths is always changing as emerging technologies permit us to observe phenomena in new ways, which in turn produces new ways of confirming or disconfirming our scientific truths. The point, of course, is that the basis for falsifying truth is always changing, both for phenomenology as well as for the natural sciences. So, with respect to phenomenology, one obvious question would be, exactly how are our experiential reference points shifting and changing? Well, there are probably many plausible answers to that question. However, one important source for such change would reside in the fact that meditative practices and meditative experiences are currently proliferating throughout our Western culture. And while there are many different types of meditation that derive from many different sources, one of the main types is meditation as it's described and practiced within a Buddhist framework. Over the last 2,500 years, historians have characterized Buddhism's evolution partially in terms of various transmissions of the Dharma, temporally over generations, and culturally over different geographic parts of the globe. However, over the past half-century or so, Buddhism and Buddhist meditative practice have become increasingly common in the Western world. So much so that some commentators have begun to speak of a Western transmission, a great tidal influx of Buddhist thought and practice across Europe and the Americas. The implication for phenomenology, of course, is that if more people are experiencing deep meditative states of consciousness, it's likely to alter the necessary referential foundation for falsifying or confirming the validity of phenomenological insights. And if this referential foundation is indeed shifting in a substantial way, it would then require that we revisit or rework previous seminal phenomenological works to determine if their revelations are still confirmed by our new pool of life experiences. Such would be the case, for instance, with respect to the work of Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and others, as well as with regard to the multitude of lesser luminaries who have been conducting more explicitly empirical phenomenological research within the domain of psychology and other disciplines. Let's look at an example. One fairly obvious place to glimpse all of this is in Jean-Paul Sartre's emphasis on the primacy of freedom and choice in our existential reality. For Sartre, our existential reality boils down to the ensemble of our factical choices, most of which we make pre-reflectively and which primarily take the form of definite actions that we take through our lives. From Sartre's perspective, all of our particular choices are subtended by our master project, which is, as he puts it, the desire to be God. However, from a Buddhist perspective, as articulated in Chogyam Trungpa's The Myth of Freedom, for example, the whole structure of making choices according to our desires is really little more than another way of being enslaved to our desires, basically just another way of living out our attachments and cravings, which is ultimately the real source of misery in our lives. From this perspective, genuine freedom issues from our capacity to let go of our attachments and desires, or at least not to be so thoroughly ruled by them. Genuine freedom is less about being full of desires and volition, and more about being adaptable, accepting, and unattached. Our desire to be God, then, ends up being much less like an inescapable ontological necessity, and more like a kind of protracted developmental phase we must pass through on our way to letting go of our habitual attachments, even at the deepest levels of our being. The point, of course, is that the phenomenological meaning of freedom, and hence the falsifiability of Sartre's phenomenological insights into it, change as a function of our ability to experience freedom from a meditative point of view. This is true at the individual level, as well as at the level of our collective and cultural meaning-making processes. However, another place to glimpse the shifting intersection between meditative awareness and phenomenology has to do with the kind of consciousness that phenomenology requires in the first place. For instance, early in Being and Time, Martin Heidegger characterizes the movement of phenomenology as letting that which shows itself be seen from itself in the very way in which it shows itself from itself. However, it seems obvious that not all states of consciousness would be able to accomplish that task equally well. Some states of consciousness would seem better suited to letting things become directly apparent to our awareness than others are. For instance, when our consciousness is cluttered and preoccupied with various concerns and desires, it's difficult to reflect upon and understand the meaning of our experience in any reasonably clear way. Doing that is much better served by a state of consciousness that is relatively placid and tranquil. For practiced meditators, this is an obvious point, since our meditative experience tells us that a blank, unobstructed, fully present state of consciousness is more likely to allow us to perceive things clearly and fully. This would naturally include our capacity to become aware of phenomenological insights, as well as to validate and appreciate other people's phenomenological insights. Basically, our capacity to see things from the perspective of relatively unoccupied meditative consciousness helps us both to have and to appreciate phenomenological realizations. But here again, the idea that our larger culture might be moving toward a Western transmission where meditative consciousness is relatively common has implications for phenomenology's project. First, because it would make phenomenological insights more accessible and compelling to a larger fraction of our populace. Beyond that, however, it would also mean that more people would be capable of actually engaging in phenomenological reflection. The natural upshot of all of this would be that as our culture shifts more toward a meditative way of life, phenomenology's basic project would be able to occupy a larger, more important place among our shared meaning-making processes. In my own view, this is a propitious development. First, because it would probably lead to a broadening of our epistemological horizons beyond the purview of a narrow objectivistic empiricism, but also because it might help draw us toward actually living in a more intimate, more mindful relation to our existential condition. So, let me end here by summarizing the main points of this video. First, The falsifiability of phenomenological insights resides in the degree to which they accord with the reader's individual experience, and then whether that accord is shared collectively by many people across our social world. Second, the basis for falsifying phenomenological insights consequently varies as our shared reservoir of experience changes over time. Third, Buddhist meditative consciousness is coming to occupy an increasing fraction of our shared cultural experience and is even beginning to coalesce into a Western transmission of Buddhist thought and practice. Fourth, as a consequence of this, the basis for falsifying phenomenological insights is also changing, which would necessitate a reevaluation of the truth value of previous phenomenological works and insights in light of our expanding meditative awareness. And finally, since meditative consciousness is also conducive to having and appreciating phenomenological insights in the first place, its increasing commonality would allow phenomenology to flourish in our culture as an expansion of our shared epistemological horizons, which in turn would help us both to become more mindfully cognizant of our existential condition, as well as to learn to live in ways that are more faithful to the existential reality we're already inhabiting. Not a bad bargain, at least in my view.